Hey everyone, my name is Elio Narciso. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Scalestack. Welcome to the Revenue Engine Masters podcast. As you know, we typically dig into AI, go to market, and all the ways in which businesses are changing, work is changing. And today's guest has really interesting background to me, like because he started as a scientist, but now is like deeply involved in AI at larger scale with IBM. And Dr. Annunziata, he's of Italian descent, which we were just chatting earlier. I'm Italian, as you know. He's currently the director of AI, open innovation at IBM, and also a co-founder, which is interesting to me, like being founders within larger companies. So maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. Of the AI Alliance, which is something that IBM and Meta started together and now has lots of members across the globe. But you also like a physicist with like lots of patents, which is also very interesting. It's been, I have to say, like a life goal of mine eventually to own like in my name, like a patent. So maybe I'll ask you about that too. Anthony, welcome to the podcast. Maybe like you want to tell us briefly about you. And so maybe the first question is really like, why are we here? Like, how did you get here? Like in broad strikes, basically.
Sure. Well, Elio, thanks so much for having me on. I'm excited to be here. Happy to tell you a little bit about how I got here. It's a many-part path. I'll try to keep it brief. As you mentioned, I started as a physicist. I was trained as a physicist. I went to grad school. I started at IBM doing research into magnetic devices, so trying to build better memory, better transistors, but based out of magnetic materials and devices.
Yeah.
And, I did that for a while. It was great, but I was really hungry to keep going more in the direction of applying and bringing things out to the broader world to make sure that they have broader impact. And I found that very satisfying. So what I was able to do in a few steps is, always like important to convince management that you can do something. But once you can do that, you can have opportunities. And I had several opportunities inside IBM to build a new quantum computing business, to build a new AI for science platform, which we launched during the pandemic, where science was on everyone's mind.
Yeah.
And more recently, in the generative AI era, I really kind of take lead of IBM's open source AI strategy and launch what I think is a really interesting organization called the AI Alliance. And tell you more about that in just a moment,
Yeah.
alongside another part of my mission, which is very important, which is to work across our startup partners and to try to help them use IBM technologies better, and to try to help bring their technologies with us to market in more places at more scale.
Very good. Very interesting. So let's unpack that. And maybe the first thing I'm curious about is that, like, as a physicist and a researcher, like, I think the mindset and mentality is very different than, like, as you said, like applied science, no? And so maybe the first curiosity I have is like, what parts of that, like, researcher mentality is helpful today in your like, applied science work? And which
Yeah.
part is not? Maybe.
Yeah. So first, I like to remind people I'm not just a scientist, I'm a physicist.
Yes.
Physicists think about things in actually really basic terms, right? I know it maybe sounds weird to say, oh, physicists only deal with basic things, but it's true. Fundamental, basic building blocks of nature, right? So when you're a physicist, you're taught to think very deeply and very foundationally. Like, what are the really essential elements for how something works? What really
Mhm.
matters? What doesn't? What's the simplest model you can create to explain something, right? That something could be, an atom or a transistor, or it could be something more complicated, could be a product or a business. Now, the same exact, approach doesn't fully apply, but this idea of thinking in first principles and foundational ways, I think, has been extremely helpful in everything I've done. Trying to just drill through like what really matters. How do we structure thinking? How do we structure a go to market, right? What matters when you're building a go to market? What are the
Mhm.
fundamental things? So I'd say that type of scientific thinking, especially the physics thinking, is super helpful with everything I've
First
done.
principles is something that we use a lot in the tech industry. So what's,
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's a lot of physicists in the tech industry, as you know,
yeah,
especially
yeah.
in AI. And I think there's a reason for that. Now, on the flip side, not everything. is transferable. One of the things I'd say that is a challenge for researchers, and me included, or was, I think I've mostly gotten through it, but you can be the judge, is in research, you're always pushing the envelope and trying to come up with a new discovery, a new insight, and publish it and get the word out. But then you're kind of like, that's victory, right? Once you've discovered something and you've communicated it to the scientific community, then you keep going. You discover something new. Like, so there's this, you're always pursuing new information, new understanding, but you're not like building and shipping a product or completing a deal. So there's a little bit like of going further than science means you have to kind of extend your definition of done, right?
Mm,
So for example, when you're engineering and shipping a product, just demoing it is not nearly enough, right? And you see that challenge in agents today, right? Demoing an agent is extremely easy. Shipping it to production, you know, in a reliable, trusted way, evaluated the way in a way that actually matters is actually a lot harder. So I'd
mm.
say that challenge going from research to more of a business mindset is like to extend and kind of bolster that definition of done to make sure it matches what the world expects.
So while you were talking, I was thinking that, I mean, in my home country, Italy, we have like too much of the science and too little of the application. And so I was trying to ask myself, like, what is that, like, is different? In other words, like, is it you become successful at what you do now because you're more entrepreneurial, you think? And that you're not satisfied with just like the theoretical layer, but then just to see it in action in real life. And so keep pushing the envelope and keep pushing the bar so that it sort of satisfies you and because you're creating something that did not exist.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a big part of it. Trying to, yeah, I mean, for me, the personal satisfaction with going further. And I think also just looking at whether it's products or businesses or people that have been successful in that way, it was inspiring. And
Mm.
so to me, yeah, it just made sense as something I wanted to push farther along. Yeah, I don't know. The bigger question of cultural differences, organizational, that's a big topic. An interesting one though. I think for me personally though, it was just kind of something that just made a lot of sense.
Yeah. No, because if you think, I mean, like, so Renaissance in Italy, right? So there was a lot of science, a
Yeah.
lot of theory, but also a lot of like, applications. I mean, buildings, churches, like, if you go to Florence, like, the chapel there, like, in the Duomo is like
Yeah.
an incredible technology that was theory only like a few years before they decided to go and build it. And so to me, it's like we sort of lost it in Italy, by the way, over the last like century or, maybe, I don't know, maybe the last 50 years. But I do think it's this hunger for like just not to think something, but then I actually want to touch it and see if it actually works, even though the theory tells me that it does, because then once you start doing something, there is like a million problems.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, like, you don't really know if it works, whatever it is,
Yeah. If you
until
actually do
you
it, yes.
build it, do it, ship it. And actually, I think the other, really big realization, I mean, you as an entrepreneur, I mean, I think probably get this from very long ago, but it doesn't really work until someone else thinks it works and uses it and actually pays for it or validates it in some strong way, independent of you.
Yes. I've also experienced that in Europe. So I was talking to someone, there was this huge, huge program that the European community put together 10 years ago. They had billions of euros because they said, we're going to like start innovation, like, and push Europe like to become like more, like the US, billions of euros available. And they started funding, and we got some money from my prior company. We got some money, and, but then essentially the people that were funding were mostly researchers and scientists, which really looked and remain like crazy looking. What I mean by that is that what you just said, that like someone else needs to follow you. Someone else needs to believe exactly what you believe. Otherwise, you stay as like, the researcher level that like, yeah, I mean, in his or her mind, like this is true, but it's not true for most people. And there is no new future that has been created. I don't know, maybe I'm poo-pooing researchers, but like, it is not what I think. I think like you do need some validation.
I'd say that, the currency or transaction or validation for researchers is just kind of different, right? There's a whole economy around research. And I don't mean like a money economy, just like publish, citation, the whole citation economy, citations as a measure of worth, right? Like there's a whole kind of economy around it, but it's not the same as the broader actual economy.
You played that game too, right? To
Oh
have
yeah,
like a
for
hand.
sure,
Yeah.
for sure.
Are you still playing it or no? Not anymore.
Not in a while. I did. I was part of let's see, when was the last paper I was a co-author on? About a year and a half ago. So
Okay.
not like distant past, but it's been a little while since I've been in the thick of research or
And
filing
is
patents.
the patents like similar to that game, to that type of economy, you think?
Somewhat. Patents are funny, right? And by the way, the field that you're working in plays a big role in whether you can get a lot of patents or not, right? So I happen to be in fields that were amenable to like very novel structures and processes that we could patent. If you're a software engineer or an AI researcher, it's actually harder to patent kind of AI methods and concepts. Those would be so not to go too deep, but like short primer on patents, like
Yes.
and you can imagine because a lot of the concept of patents and the rules and the patent agency in the US emerged from like a time period where things were very physical, right? So physical structures are much more straightforward to patent. So if you have like a physical thing,
Yeah.
but software or data structure or data, that's a lot harder. That tends to fall under like a method patent, but methods are a little murky. They're hard to kind of patent, right? So that's why it's one reason I think you don't see as many patents in software and AI, just because it's kind of less of a fit to like traditionally how we understand and how the law views patents, right?
Yeah, very interesting. So I think that this is relevant to to what we're discussing here because like how do you generate innovation? Like it is like to try to convince someone to follow you, no? And then what I'm curious about is that you spent most of the last 15 or so years at IBM, no? And so then there is the other angle, which is innovation in a large company. And I've had some taste of that because I told you, like I spent some time at Amazon. And so maybe another question is, okay, you need to have a certain entrepreneurial mindset to transfer like science and research into like applied stuff. Then like within a larger company, I mean, people tend to think the larger companies don't innovate as much as smaller companies. And so, what have you found to be true in order to succeed as an entrepreneur within a larger company?
Yeah. Let me start by saying there is a small part of my resume. It doesn't always pop up. I actually did co found a company in grad school with a couple of other friends.
Okay.
We made it not too far. We actually were in an early class of Y Combinator back in 2008.
Nice. Okay.
And it was a wearable sleep analytics product. It didn't get
Okay.
that, but kind of long fun story for why I did get that far. The net was like I've always had that kind of itch. I went to IBM as a researcher. I kind of every few years was like, I gotta start something new. Is it still going to be at IBM? I'd ask that all the time, and IBM keeps giving me really interesting opportunities to start new things. And if you could do that right inside a big company, there are some advantages. Like you can leverage the scale, you can leverage the connections, the go-to-market apparatus, like is very well formed. So if you can manage to innovate in a big company and take it forward, there are some advantages a big company has. There are disadvantages too, right? It's complex, lots of decision makers. Although in aggregate, there's lots of resources. Getting resources to do something new is hard. It's very hard,
Hmm.
actually. You need to really make a convincing case and have people trust you and prove yourself. But if you can do that, I would say that fundamental innovation does still happen in a lot of big companies. IBM has
Absolutely.
a deep tradition in research and in our development, of coming up with a lot of new innovative things. I think the challenge is not kind of the kernel of innovation. The challenge is how can you scale it up inside of a big org where there's a lot of complexity?
Yeah. And so now you are like in charge of open source AI at IBM, which is also like, well, maybe actually you can explain what your job is more precisely, but it also is not just creating innovation within IBM, but then convincing other companies, right, to adopt open source AI. And so first, maybe if you can explain what is the job actually today, how big is your team and what is
Sure.
the charter essentially? And then maybe what it takes to convince others about what you guys are trying to do.
Sure. Yeah. So today I actually have two roles. One is the open source ecosystem and strategy development role. The other is actually working with our partners to help support and build out go-to-market that's joint with IBM,
Okay.
mostly on ISV partners. On the open source side, what I do, fundamentally, IBM is actually a business that's been built on open source for a long time. And
Hmm.
even if you look at our recent large acquisitions, Red Hat, Confluent, Hashi, open source is a big component of those businesses, right?
Yeah.
And it's not because it's just a good thing or charitable and all that. That's true. That's nice. But it's a very good way to base a
A better
business.
way to build.
Yeah, better way to build. Why? Why is it a better way to build? Well, you're pulling together innovation from the open community.
Many people,
You
yes.
have like much easier ways to access, to get started, to contribute. So you have innovation, you have validation, you have transparency, right? As you know well, lots of companies still value that. Now in the AI era, there's a whole like hierarchy of priorities, and sometimes that falls by the wayside because we just need to keep moving and innovating. And I'll get to that in a moment. But I would say that many organizations still in the AI era care a lot about whether fundamentally the core technology is open source, whether it's transparent, whether it's accessible,
Yeah.
auditable, I mean, all of that, right? Part of my job is to kind of work across IBM and develop kind of the next generation of strategies, specifically on AI, models, eval, data structures, tools, all of that. And then a big part of it is to work out in the community and engage partners and contribute to open source projects and try to support them in particular, ones that we think are going to be important for the future, right? So, you know, new methods to evaluate AI, new methods to tune models, that kind of thing.
And I mean, AI itself, I mean, we just had like Elon Musk bring into court
Yeah,
Sam Altman because I mean, OpenAI, just like the name, was born as an
that's
open,
right. It was a nonprofit organization, open source focused, right?
right? And so, but then it's not now, right? So it's a closed model. And so, like, what do you think, how is it going to play out in your, so like they will coexist like closed models and open source, or you think that like open source models will eventually win?
So I think the regime we're in now is everybody like, okay, let's start from the user side and then we could get to the
Yeah.
developer, the tech company side. Look, I think everything's moving so quickly that people just are going to grab whatever is best/most convenient and run with it. And, you know, well-managed platform services tied to frontier models that are proprietary, it works to do that for a while.
Yeah.
Now, I think you already see that, fundamental progress in models has slowed down. At the same time, the cost of progress on the margin is high. It's getting higher for lots of reasons: size, scale, amount of data needed, et cetera. And you already see kind of the effects of that, right? Like OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, others aggressively moved up stack. They have more comprehensive offerings, right? I mean, I think if you look at Claude Code, Claude Desktop, right? Cowork versus just the raw model. Like arguably the key reason Anthropic has been so successful is because they've built this really good product experience right around the model, which has a lot of sophistication. So I think you already see the market moving past the model itself as the key differentiation point. And
So
then
it doesn't matter that much. Yes.
it matters,
I mean, it
but
matters. I mean, models are like, yeah,
so
but
so
less
what else?
so.
I'll extrapolate and say what that means is other factors like once now that it's becoming the case that you can get really good models in lots of places, both open source or proprietary. Other factors, traditional factors, cost, the ability to deploy on your own infrastructure, the ability to tune in your own way, and so on. They're gonna factor more. And I do think that will lead to open models being more and more popular. And I think you already see signals of that.
Yeah. 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 That's exactly how we see. And that's what I meant. Like, that it doesn't matter, meaning that like it becomes commoditized. I mean, in many ways, they are like phenomenal models, but like, it's
And
just
there's a
like
whole
data.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
there's a whole next generation of model architecture that is coming on the scene. World models based on, for example, Jan LeCun's JEPA architecture. That's cutting edge stuff. That is going to be differentiated for a while. The model there is going to I think rapidly progress in capability, but that's a very different architectural approach. So LLMs, transformer based, I won't say they're commodity yet, but they're on the way. And so
What
that
about developing your own model? Like, so small language models, like, do you think the companies should start thinking about that?
I think there's steps before getting all the way to that. I think taking, the right open weight model and, fine tuning it, or if you're proficient with RL, having an RL pipeline that, you can run with your environment in mind. That's probably the better way to kind of create a custom model for now.
Yeah, very good. And then let's go back to the question about like enterprise adoption. No? So like, you started stuff inside of IBM, like, we're talking about like AI, but so how do you convince maybe other companies that are not, building just like IBM or Meta or OpenAI, like the AI itself, that this is the new world? What you've seen like changing the mentality or the culture of people in adoption that like, switches from, oh, we're like checking and piloting to actual adoption? What's been like things that you've seen across customers that need to happen?
So I think the first is kind of a team or leadership or cultural kind of aspect, which is
Hmm.
people that I think there needs to be a willingness to embrace the full challenge, right? Which is to acknowledge that an enterprise application of AI is going to need more than just prompting, a cloud hosted model, right? An eval strategy that's not just an academic benchmark will need to be developed. Like real integration with the workflow and thinking how that's going to work
Yeah.
needs to happen. So I think it's first just have a good understanding that you're jumping into something that has it's going to need a fair bit of focus and some work, right? Not just kind of a demo and okay, now it works because it doesn't many times. I think technically, I would say that a well thought out eval strategy, like definition of success, and what I mean is not just kind of the academic benchmarks. Okay, do some QA question answer pairs, and oh, it looks good, golden, we're
Yeah.
good to go. I mean, like, comprehensively. Like first, like specifically to your use cases, how you're really going to measure, in development and then in production. How are you going to monitor? How are you going to ensure that in production when you get lots of prompts and lots of things you haven't maybe tested explicitly, how are you going to envelope and make sure that the system is working? Admittedly, it's still not going to be fully deterministic. So I think like the right eval strategy grounded in the use cases, not just kind of one time at development. That I see as a really key thing. Um, and then I'd say, after that, yeah, I think just a kind of smart understanding progression of where to start and how to scale up in steps. Like I think internal pilots and internal use cases have been a good pattern of success that I've seen. So start internally, start with your internal user base. And, if you're a good sized company that has pretty good scale, so you can learn a lot that way.
So you're saying back office, start from the back office?
It doesn't have to be back office, but yeah, just internal users first. I've seen as kind of a good step to prove out something beyond like a demo, but not quite live external production.
Yeah. What about a topic that is dear to my heart, which is like data preparedness? Have you seen that as like, also a differentiating factors across like successful
Big time.
companies?
Yeah, I should have led with that actually. I could keep going. There's a lot of but yeah, we could talk all day about that. Yeah. So fundamentally, if you go back to the argument that, the model itself is commoditizing, then what's the differentiator, right? Okay, so for a tech company, you're going to build a product experience, developer experience, SDK. Okay, there's a lot of stuff. But if you're, a company that just wants to use AI, it's going to be your data, your knowledge, right? So that actually means not only is data prep and, context preparation, a knowledge platform, right? The ability,
Yeah.
like, not only is that important, it's almost like before long, like the only differentiator. So totally important. I think that, yeah, I could go on. Personally, I think that depending on the domain, like well structured, semantically driven, ontologically driven layers are going to be increasingly important. Um, yeah, we could,
Yeah. No,
yeah. So
that's a failure that we see. I think, yeah, you're totally right. Like the culture, the commitment, like the connection. I mean, you talked about integration with existing workflows. We 100% believe that back office are great ways to begin. I mean, maybe internal processes in your languages, but because I think that there is so much that we still need to learn that like starting from like frontline stuff, it's very hard, but there is so much inefficiencies in everything that we do, particularly like, in
sure.
what is the first thing that AI has created like tremendous efficiency? Coding, right? And so no developer right now is writing code. No good developer right now is writing code because I mean it was so efficient to begin with. And now applying AI is like, made the whole thing possible at
For
completely
sure.
different speed and efficiency. Sales and marketing, which is sort of like the space where Scalestack operates, it's still very inefficient. And so starting from internal processes and back office, it is what we also believe is a great opportunity. And then, yeah, data preparedness, because we see it everywhere. They're like, you launch a pilot, oh, it's failed. Like, no, it's the model. No, actually, the model is like irrelevant. That's what I mean. We
Yeah,
can
yeah.
only do these things because models are so sophisticated. But once you have them, if
That's
you don't
right.
have good data,
That's right. That's right. And you can, even through a pilot stage, you can mislead yourself to think you've got something that really is good and scales, but mostly you're relying on the model, and then that'll break down, as you try to scale it up into and out. Yeah, I'd say like also if you look at data, right? How do people use data? Okay, so for a couple of years we've been talking about, RAG retrieval, semantic search and retrieval, that kind, and that's fine and still works okay for basics, but doesn't, it doesn't always work, and certainly doesn't always work when you have, large data, when you have high accuracy requirements and so on. So I do think that, ways to better structure, context data, to better update, right, context structure is gonna be even just more and more important.
and then, I mean, there is a whole topic within this, which is like, companies I think are like moving fast, trying to adopt AI in pilots, in larger deployments. I think that like a lot of the security concerns that we had until like a moment ago are now gone, but will reemerge very soon, because your employees are, sending potentially like private, very sensitive data to these models. And so we are starting to see, particularly in Europe, which is, always very concerned about privacy. I mean, think about GDPR. We're starting to see some European customers that are telling us, like, we'd like to do this on prem. And so, do you see that? Is this like something that IBM is thinking about, or you personally in
Absolutely.
your team?
It's a big part of our focus in business, actually, even in the US.
Even in the US. Okay.
Even in the US, yeah, I mean, certainly, Europe and some other places internationally are, like, even more focused on it, but even in the US, regulated industries, I mean, certainly government, but I think there's a growing realization that in the era of AI, it may be even more important. 'Cause now
Mm.
it's not just a vendor lock-in and kind of, kinda cost story. Now it's like there's a true, like, privacy beyond just personal privacy, like, privacy in the sense that, like, if it's so easy for AI systems to learn from the prompts, from the data you send them, from the patterns of workflow, right? They're very smart. So the big model companies, they are learning everything possible. So if we're not careful, and companies know this, you're gonna transfer your proprietary differentiation to a tech company very quickly. So I think that one is
And so
really
that means also open source or small. I mean, like it's all interconnected, no? Because
interconnected.
if you believe that, you have also to think, well, okay, if I want to do on prem, I cannot do OpenAI or
That's
Anthropic. I
right.
need to,
That's right.
right? And so,
Or you'll
how
be
do you
sparse.
solve that? Sorry, say it again.
I said, or you'll be sparse and careful about what you use large scale cloud hosted models to do, right? Yeah. I mean, you may still want to, yeah, use them for some things.
So distribute, like not just one model, distribute like the workflows and the use cases across models. Is that what you?
Yeah, I mean, that's one tack you could take. I think the simplest is though, determine a set of use cases that you could reasonably support with, kind of a smaller mid-sized model, and then deploy locally, right, in a stack that can support it, inference and, deploying agents and all of that. And, I think it's the case with most enterprise use cases that a small model in a reasonably scalable stack is good. It'll actually serve the use case need because, if you look at, one of the large proprietary models, they're trying to be general everything, right? You can ask
Yeah.
them what to cook for dinner. You can ask them to analyze your data. You can, most enterprise use cases are more focused than that, right? And so if you could be more focused, then you can do something that's lighter. So a smaller model, the right engineered context, the right eval strategy, and you can serve that locally on reasonable hardware. So yeah, we can do that today. IBM has a, kind of growing business in supporting those sorts of use cases across, IBM, Red Hat, new acquisition. Like we're very excited about Confluent, who's just joined the
Confluent,
company
yes.
to add, lots of streaming data, which you can do a lot with in the AI context now.
Yeah. Yeah. Super interesting. And then, like, Yeah, the differentiation of the use case, I think it's also very important. And like to help companies, like, okay, there are certain things that maybe is not like as critical, to, be protective about your data because maybe it's mostly data that is outside of the company. It's often like our use cases, right? So like, okay, I want to prioritize sales and marketing efforts or even like HR workflows when I do candidate recruiting, mapping. That's mostly data that it's outside of the company, no?
Yeah,
And
that's
so
right.
for
That's right.
that,
Yeah. Internet-based market research, public domain things. There's a lot of stuff.
correct.
Kind of what I mentioned before. Yeah, sure. Use whatever model for that stuff you'd like. It's public domain mostly anyway. But,
For
if
your
it's,
data, yeah.
yeah, if it's something that is about your proprietary manufacturing process or hey, something deep in the architecture of your back end for your systems, like, yeah, maybe use a local model for that.
Yeah. And can you give an example for the audience about like what's a local model?
Sure. Yeah. So if
Because
you look
everybody is familiar with like the Anthropic of this world,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah. So, I mean, if you look out today, you have Google's Gemma models are very good. Mistral in Europe, you talked about Europe. They're making lots of progress with open weight models, certainly still from Meta. IBM, of course, has our Granite series of models, which are small models. So the whole strategy there is not to try to compete at the super large scale, but
generalist model, yeah.
kind of small to medium scale models that are good fits for enterprise use cases. And there's others as well.
And so, for instance, for the IBM models, like what are they good at? Like what type of use cases that you found like a lot of success within companies that are concerned, let's say, about like having their data protected?
Yeah, yeah. So Granite has a family of small models that are text and image, right? So multimodal. And if you think about a lot of what, there's a whole lot of enterprise use cases that are somehow ingest documents, you know, and then do stuff with that knowledge, right? So Q&A, generate, et cetera. So, one of the things Granite has focused on is the ability through, vision language models and then, kind of pure language processing to be able to ingest, structure, summarize, generate from, understand business documents.
Yeah. And so is that like the charter of your team? Is that like what you're helping customers with, or you're helping like ISVs, like, be
So
more fluent?
yeah, so I focus on two things. So first, work in the open source community with partners to drive fundamental advancement in new open source projects and AI. So that's the AI Alliance's mission. We have 205 partner companies in 29 countries doing that. We collaborate on many projects and topics. There's a new one I'll tell you more about in just a moment called Tapestry, which is a very ambitious project led by Jan LeCun, and it is we are going to build a globally sourced foundation model. So we're going to bring data together from across many different organizations globally, do it in a
Mhm.
privacy and ownership preserving way, and train a model that could be better than anyone else could train because this way of consortium training is what we're calling it could access much more information, much more data to train than any other single organization because we have this distributed ownership structure. The goal there is to build a foundation model that is beyond current frontier capability, but is an open based model and one that is held by a consortium, right? By the Alliance as a neutral entity so that anybody can take and use it and customize it and build on it. And therefore, can you enable their AI model sovereignty that way?
What's a good metaphor of stuff that has happened in the past? Because I mean, like in cloud, that's not really what happened, right? So in cloud, you have like Google, AWS, Microsoft. I mean, I always try to look for other examples, metaphor, things that have happened in the past. I mean, like for instance, I don't know. I started my career in mobile technology, really, no? And so, like, I remember when we were telling customers, oh, there is going to be more phones, which is really like, connected devices than people. And everybody was like, oh, you guys are crazy. And then, like, that's what we have now, right? And so now we're saying, like, oh, there's going to be more agents and workers by like a large amount.
I'm sure
So
there's already way more agents than tech workers.
you think?
I think so. I mean, I think every developer has multiple agents basically running at any given. I mean, I have
Yeah. If you,
over there. Yeah.
And so, yeah, what is a good metaphor for something like this, like the open model to succeed?
I think there's a pretty good metaphor in Linux, and I think there's a decent metaphor in Kubernetes. You mentioned the cloud era. So let's maybe just spend a minute on those. So Linux, I mean, everybody knows Linux, right? Open source operating system. It runs most of the business and server world at this point. It wasn't always that way. Windows had a very strong position back in the day. IBM and others, IBM played a leading role here to promote Linux and to build that as a true, robust, open source operating system that businesses could rely on. And now, I mean, it's everywhere, right? I mean, all the proprietary clouds are running Linux, basically,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So Linux as this fundamental open platform to build on is a decent analogy, actually, to
Yeah, it's
where
great. I
we
love
think,
it. Yes.
yeah. You also brought up,
Almost this invisible layer, no? Because now nobody thinks about that. But back in the day, I mean, like where people were making these choices, it was very much talked about. But now it's like, a given, no?
yeah, definitely. Yeah. It's not controversial at all. It's controversial not to use Linux in
Yeah,
many.
yeah, yeah. What about Kubernetes? Because I also lived a little bit of that, and that was super
Yeah.
interesting also as an example.
Yeah, so it's super interesting, right? The big clouds, on the growth path led by AWS back, 10 or so years ago. And is that going to be the only model? Well, no, because, the ecosystem came together by Google. Red Hat had a big role there. I mean, IBM had a
Yeah.
significant role there and others, and got behind Kubernetes as a standard and, as a platform.
It started at Google, right? I think Google was. I
Yeah,
think so,
it
yeah.
was internal project at Google, was
Yeah.
open source very early on, and a number of people that kind of knew that, public cloud only deployment is not going to work for everybody jumped on that bandwagon. It's not just a very strong and popular platform, it's growing. And it's growing even more in the AI era in some ways, because kind of like what we've been talking about, right? I think people realize that, managing your own AI is not just a cost and privacy concern. It's like a fundamental
Yeah.
preservation of your business value concern.
Yeah. Anthony, this was super interesting. I recognize that I may not have followed strictly the guide that I sent you, but we went into many interesting areas. And so I want to thank you for being here and sharing all these ideas and knowledge with me and with people. So thank you very much. And definitely let's follow up.
That'd be great.
All right, Anthony, thank you so much.
Elio, good to meet you. Thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you.